On the 27th of April 2021, the Leviathan update and DLC for EU4 would release. This was almost 5 years ago, as of making this video, well 4 years and 10 months ago, and yet this DLC release would fundamentally change EU4 forever. This one DLC would be single-handedly the largest, biggest update the game received up to that point, and now that EU4 is no longer in development, we can also say it was the biggest update full stop. No other update or patch would be as transformative to the playing of EU4 as the whole of Leviathan was. However, it would also leave a permanent impact on EU4 in a more negative manner. It is, after all, the DLC from which the phrase Leviathan moment was born, and very rightfully so. The release of Leviathan was EU4's darkest hour, and no other point in EU4 history did I believe player sentiment to ever get that low. And had the consequences of Leviathan been different, from Paradox's side, Leviathan very much could have been the DLC that killed EU4. Today, I think it's important we revisit this story. Now, EU4 at the point of Leviathan was no stranger to controversy. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through the whole history here, but for example, the Cossacks DLC was, shall we say, not universally praised. Still though, walking into the 27th of April, EU4 had a backlog of pretty good DLC releases, from Golden Century to Rule Britannia to Mandate of Heaven. However, like any good story, there was some foreshadowing. The DLC before Leviathan was Emperor, which unfortunately would launch with a game-breaking bug that severely hindered you playing in Europe or the surrounding area. No, I'm not joking, the TLDR is that the Holy Roman Empire rework let you invite people into the HRE, gaining imperial authority whenever you did so. If you were playing as Austria, you could invite basically every single small nation out there, from Brittany to Albania into the HRE, gain authority from doing so, and get a 1446 revoke, which, included not just all of Germany, but half of Europe as well in the process. On the other hand, AI emperors would not invite many people, sure, but they would invite random people, meaning that if you were playing as the Ottomans, for example, you could have Albania randomly join the empire, and that's going to make expansion into Albania 50 times more painful than it should be. It would be fixed post-release, but there were also a slew of smaller bugs like that, and it was rightfully mean for being a buggy mess of a release. However, the free revoke patch has been removed from the Steam betas. It's no longer accessible, mainly I believe because you could choose a lot of achievements with it, and overall, it didn't take too long to get fixed. I mean, it was a couple days at most. No, the Prelude to Leviathan was optimistic, actually very optimistic. Paradox already communicated quite a bit with their players, all things considered, but the level of communication before Leviathan felt different. Simply put, there was a lot more of it. It seemed a lot more honest and frank about what was being done with the game, why it was being done, and the vision behind it. Now, this is just a feeling. My only real source for this feeling was I was there reading the dev diaries, looking at the comments, and talking about them with other EU4 players, both in real life and over the internet, who were sharing similar sentiments. I hadn't done anything on YouTube at that point, so for those wondering, no, I'm speaking purely from the lens of a player. The tone, nevertheless, was very optimistic, but I and a couple others have found was a weird eagerness, dare I say, from the developers, in some ways which was almost too eager. What I mean by this very strange statement is that, for example, they would show off the new Seek mechanics in the dev diary, but the UI art for it was missing. And some people in the dev diary would ask about it, and the dev said, don't worry, it was just a quick screenshot for a dev diary, the missing art is already fixed. This was a bit weird, to be honest. Usually they would put stuff in the dev diary after they finished making it, so in essence what you see in the dev diary is what you got in the game, but we kind of hand-waved it away, and we are all human after all, and miscommunications and mismanagement and random off-puttings between development and getting a dev diary out, those can all happen. That all being said, the communication was quite popular and well received given the scope of the update. I mean, the amount of stuff being added and talked about was shaping up to be a really positive, big, transformative DLC. Like, so many things are being improved here. And we aren't just talking about Southeast Asia, the focus of the DLC, no. It brought in a rework to colonial nations that let countries concentrate development. It would rework the whole state system and introduce government capacity, and give more options for tour play with things like expand infrastructure. There was a whole host of smaller things too, everything from the ability to draft transport ships to specific governments, to things like the ability to create carpet sieges, to reworks to religions from totemists to Sikhs as previously mentioned before. There were new idea groups for theocracy, steppe hordes and natives, huge map reworks, and who could forget the monument system itself, that was all being introduced. It was recently added to Crusader Kings 2 to frankly universal approval, or as universal as you get from a Paradox game, so overall, this whole update was shaping up to be incredible. Good times ahead for EU4 and Paradox as a whole. But then Leviathan actually released. Spoilers, Paradox lied. About quite a few things, but for example about the Seek dev art from the dev diary, yeah, they actually shipped the Seek UI like this. Hey though, at least the Seek religion worked, which is not something you could say about the rest of the update. Lays from social streamers would have just under a 5-minute video where he spends pretty much the whole thing talking about bugs, and even chaps like Zevik would slide in with a video about getting infinite development, because of course you could. This was done by stealing so much dev into your capital, by the way, that you would stack overflow the cost of development, making it a 0. Yeah, there was a Reddit and forum megathread created for bug lists if you want a more complete picture, and indeed to just give a few brief highlights of the funnier bugs. Hordes had a policy for 100% missionary strength instead of the intended plus 1% missionary strength, allowing for instant religious conversions. Republics gained the ability to elect 0-olds into office, who, by the way, would sometimes have diplomatic skills in the thousands. Remember, the cap was meant to be 6. The new reform progress mechanic would be a prelude to ChatGPT, namely it would be a computer program built using mathematics that somehow would nevertheless proceed to hallucinate mathematics in a random manner that would suggest quantum randomness being involved in the process. We also would have double Texas plains and 2 Minnesotas, only to be clear, the second Minnesota was spelled with 2 S's, so I guess that makes it fine. Wait, what's the correct way of spelling Minnesota? How many S's are you even meant to have in Minnesota? I have no idea. I could not point to Minnesota on the map to save my life. It just sounds like a made-up place, sorry. Hope they're doing fine over there. But that new stuff, surely they didn't break existing mechanics. They managed to break existing mechanics. You would need separatism to take down to nothing to culture convert. But turns out, did you know that 0 is a positive number? That's right. Once a province would gain any separatism, for example if it got conquered by any nation, culture conversion became impossible, because separatism would take down to 0, but 0 is not nothing, according to paradox logic, if you will, which meant that because 0 was a positive number above 0, you could never culture convert. The other paradox, dare I say, was that tribes became immortal. When reducing a tribe to their last province, the game said you need to use the Annex Tribe War option, but you guessed it, the game didn't let you use the Annex Tribe option if you would also demand full annexation at the same time, making a full kill on a tribe quite literally impossible. Oh, and another fun mechanic, if you were a subject, and you had subjects yourself, your subjects would use your liberty desire against your overlord, instead of using their own calculations against you, which sounds very specific, but if you're playing, for example, Korea, and you stayed as a tributary of the Ming, and you would vassalize, I don't know, Japan, as long as your liberty desire against Ming was less than 50%, Japan would inherit your liberty desire and hence be loyal. The counter-argument of this is if you're also playing Korea, became disloyal against Ming, and you had a OPM subject, they would now become disloyal as well. Fun fact about all of these bugs? These aren't mechanics from Leviathan. That's just not even Leviathan related. This is just something Leviathan managed to break on the side. Completely unrelated game mechanics, the Leviathan DLC broke just for the joy of it. Grand tangent aside, beyond the funny bugs and the lack of frankly anything working, you had the crashes. It would crash all the time, completely at random with no rhyme or reason, but it also got worse somehow. See, the crashes were not just constrained to your current save file. If you got really unlucky, Leviathan could actually potentially corrupt your entire save game folder. I only have a couple cases of it happening being shown to me, but yeah, Leviathan was actually so powerful it could screw over your other save games. Like, definitionally, we're starting to approach malware now, right? It's not, it's broken or literally unplayable memes. Leviathan is starting to be associated with the term malware. But what about the game systems and mechanics introduced in Leviathan? There were a lot, right? Well, every single mechanic, ranging from new ones to old ones they touched, were either broken, bugged, or just didn't function. Sometimes a combination of all three somehow. The new government capacity mechanic, which was meant to buff tour play, would actually mean that wide became even more overpowered, and you would just go over GovCap and tank the consequences. You could, because you're now full stating the world. But also other mechanics like consolidate development would lead to Leviathan-era mega capitals with thousands of development, and even further buffs to conquest actually, as consolidating development away from newly conquered lands also conveniently decreased the overextension from it, making conquest easier. And this wasn't a bug per se, this was the functional new stuff that was working, it was just working in the completely incorrect, unintended way. The missions that were added were also balked. Half of them had broken UIs, the balancing was a complete joke, where suddenly Samoa would, for example, open with minus 50% advisor cost, but also later have plus 5% admin efficiency, which, to put into context, Germany, an endgame formable nation, would also get 5% admin efficiency, but it doesn't get minus 50% advisor cost, that'd be a bit too strong. Great projects, well, half of them were win buttons. Alhambra had 15% admin efficiency, and you had plus 10% discipline in the Baku Ateshgan monument. For context of how overpowered 10% discipline is, Prussia, with full militarization at the cap, would give you, you guessed it, 10% discipline. So you could either do Prussia and maintain full militarization, or you could build a great project for plus 10%. Thank you, Paradox. On the topic of great projects being broken, upon the release of Leviathan, before me and my friends realized it was quite literally unplayable, we wanted to see what the full scope of the great projects were, and, get them onto a list. After all, the Wikipedia had not updated yet, so there wasn't a Wikipedia source for these great projects and their bonuses. Or at least, well, we could have gone into the game files, but honestly we were not doing that at that point. Anyway, I'm going to take this opportunity to reintroduce a longtime friend of the channel, the Sick Man of Europe, who you may know from his True Pacifist World Conquest Challenge. True pacifism being, of course, no war, but also no being at war at any time, and no threatening war or hostile actions, so basically only asking people to be vassals and asking people to return calls for favors. Well, anyway, he would create a list of all great projects on release as a convenient tool to see their bonuses. I bring this up because going through the list now, you can just see how fundamentally broken and overpowered so many of the released monuments were. And when I say they were systematically overpowered, well, this is what I mean. What did the reception to Leviathan overall look like? Well, the reception was mixed. Okay, that's a lie. The reception set a new record. Leviathan became the most negatively reviewed product on Steam, and indeed this record is still unbroken to this day. No other product released on Steam has had a more negative reception than released Leviathan, so congratulations to Paradox for setting that one. The game was quite literally broken and unplayable beyond the meme, and many players, myself included, would just go back to playing pre-Leviathan patches. MP games would be hosted in pre-Leviathan versions, and those that were still involved in the EU4 scene, yeah, you guessed it, they were not playing the most recent patch for the most part. I know this not because I have hard data or anything, I just played released Leviathan and hence I know it would be impossible for them to actually play the goddamn thing. So what happened after this release? Well, a mega bug list was created and Paradox would get to fixing the full list of bugs. It would also over time, not with as much focus as on fixing the bugs, get to reworking every single mechanic there in Leviathan. I do mean it. I tried to come up with a mechanic that didn't get reworked since Leviathan release, and I just couldn't do it, right? Consolidating there was reworked, a bunch of the monuments got nerfed, you get the picture. But as bugs got fixed, new bugs got brought up that were not discovered originally, because they were blocked by a bug in front of them. EU4 would not have a feature update for almost another year because of all of the work that was involved in fixing Leviathan. With two small mission DLCs and Origins and Lines for the North Shore, but Tinto would in essence spend pretty much the next year fixing Leviathan. And for the most part, honestly, they succeeded. The future DLCs after Leviathan were good actually, domination out of mechanics and content for the big boy nations, and even added new modifiers like overextension impact and absolutism impact. King of Kings would also have a similar positive reception. The vast majority of issues, from bugs that made the update technically speaking malware, to missing localization for specific colony types, which by the way, yes, that was a bug, and took them like 3 months to fix. The colony types just did not have localization for a couple months, to be clear. Like, yeah, that all just did get fixed. However, EU4 is a complete game now, although I do say this from the point of view of Paradox Interactive no longer updating it. But this definition also means that some bugs and imbalances that were introduced by Leviathan do remain forever immortalized within EU4. Sure, things like Alhambra's plus 5% admin efficiency are still overpowered, and nerfed from the 15%, but they exist at this point intentionally, with post-Leviathan missions and updates playing around the 5% admin efficiency monument. Zoroastrianism is in my opinion also a great example of this, because while the 10% monument was reworked to strictly require the Zoroastrian religion, the religion itself is balanced around you having access to the 10% discipline monument eventually. But other aspects, dare I say, scars of Leviathan remain. For example, what would you say is the best country in EU4 for shock damage received? If you guessed this random tribe in Australia, the Tiwi, you would be correct. They never got their minus 20% shock damage received nerfed, and for context, a United Ireland with the bonus Irish tenacity has minus 10%. Bohemia has minus 5%. And the only policy in the game, or bonus from ideas towards shock damage received, would be a Horde innovative policy that gave you minus 5% shock damage received. So to say that minus 20% is completely insane is an understatement, but also, to access it, you have to play as a tribe in Australia. So let's be clear, this balance is fundamentally irrelevant to the game as a whole. To give an example of another scar that survived, the formal nation of Tiwi is something that just must be mentioned. To very briefly explain formable nations in E4 for those that are not aware, you can play a country like Dithmarschen, and then you can go ahead and form Prussia, then you can form Germany. But once you form Germany, you can't then go ahead and form Italy, because Germany is considered an end tag. So you can stack formable nations that are not end tags, but once you form an end tag, you can't form anything else. However, there are, of course, a couple exceptions to this rule. Countries like Italy and France would still want to form very specific things, namely, for example, the Roman Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire. So Paradox coded in a super end tag, which are end tags as well as other end tags like Italy, but they can be formed by end tags. Again, exceptional things like the Roman Empire at its full territorial extent. If you united that as France, you're allowed to form it despite France being an end tag. But Leviathan would add Fiji, or Vigi according to localization, which is a super end tag. Why? Well, it's due to a bug. The formation code doesn't check if you're an end tag, meaning that the Roman Empire is allowed to form the nation of Vigi. Is this relevant? No, because how many Roman Empire campaigns involve you moving your capital to Vigi and changing your primary culture to Fijian? I'm gonna go with none. However, in theory, you can do that, and that to me is a Leviathan moment. Very few of these have endured over the years, but if you look under the hood long enough, well, the scars of Leviathan are now an internal part of the DNA of EU4. And with that, we can move on to talk about EU5, and they released Leviathan again, haven't they? And before people say, how dare I defend Leviathan, I mean EU5, could I not tell that it was going to be super buggy? Let's pull up the start of the negative section of my EU5 Actually Good video from 4 months ago, 1 second. Yep, here's the video, just so you can see. This is the video in question. Let's play the start of the negatives. But that all said, let's also be honest, so far I've mentioned, a major positive and 2 negatives that are frankly positives if you're a 4K hours in EU4 kind of player. The negatives, Lemon. Is this just a glorified ad for EU5? No, that comes later on the 31st of October, actually. Make sure to use code Lemon Cake. No, my main issue at the moment, and the universe where I actually see EU5 crash and burn at the moment, are the bugs, glitches, and broken stuff just present in the game. Damn, really ironic watching this in hindsight, isn't it? That all being said, one of the more ironic things about this whole conversation is that compared to Leviathan, EU5 is actually significantly less buggy. See, where Leviathan had the common decency of informing you that it is literally unplayable by crashing conveniently around 3 seconds after you unpaused, sometimes in the process punishing you for your hubris by corrupting your other saves on the side, well, EU5 in many ways demanded your attention for you to learn just how broken and unfunctional so many of the systems were. And even as some things get fixed, those fixes just reveal new bugs that were hidden because the previous bugs meant you would never interact with those previously bugged systems, just like in the Leviathan patch. It is genuinely comical to some extent looking at the timeline for the release of Leviathan and EU5 and looking at even things like the patch density, because both had a bunch of hotfixes and patches within the couple of days of release. When Leviathan came out, a lot of people went back to play an Emperor, and we don't have player data for Leviathan, but we do have it for EU4, and it seems that EU4 has regained some popularity recently, hasn't it? I'm sure that's just a bunch of people coming back to finish their EU4 campaigns now, isn't it? And I think now is a good time to talk about the discussion around EU5 itself. Let's start, dare I say, with the funny. There is a lot of other feedback, let's go with the word feedback. Well, feedback that EU4 was good, but EU5 is bad. So what we need to do is we need to rehire the devs that made EU4 good. And the reason I find this feedback rather fascinating because we don't need to do that. It's the same devs. Like, some of you may not believe this, but you're going to have to trust me on this one. Did you know that the developers that made Leviathan made EU5 as well? But that specific comment aside, one of the sentiments I've seen as well is the belief that EU5 could be fixed. If only the devs made it more like Victoria 3, or less like Victoria 3, or more like Stay DPRK, or I don't know, made blobbing easier, or made AI blob harder, or made AI blob worse, or whatever. We are just one mechanic away, like complacency away from fixing everything. Look, it is basically impossible to critique certain mechanics of EU5 because nothing fucking works. I apologize for the language, but to put it in more polite terms, it's a bit hard commenting on a car's suspension if the steering wheel is currently bugged and cannot be used. And on note of the feedback as a whole, a sentiment I've seen expressed quite a bit recently is the idea that EU5 isn't fun because it doesn't have X, where X is missions or mana or whatever. You know what I believe kills fun though? When you decide to do a campaign and your goals and run are ruined because of bugs. This just isn't fun. It's not fun to do a colonial campaign and have a chronic 24/7 revolt from your subjects in the late game, and in the early game deal with Callum the Conquistador leading the 112th personal doomed crusade against your random 3-location minor subject. Having features like the Protestant Reformation being fundamentally not functional, and major religions like Anglicanism being relegated to an Easter egg, none of this is fun. The real miracle in some ways is, well, despite this level of Leviathan level bugs, there's enough actual new things in the game, there's enough new interactions, mechanics, and things to do that, for me personally at least, there are still things for me to have campaigns and goals and do in the game. To put more simply, fun to be had within this mess of a release. But at the same time, I feel like I'm having this fun despite EU5's best efforts, not because of it. So is EU5 just too buggy? Should it be marked early access or not even released at all? Well, I want to say no, and my reason for this logic is going to be surprisingly simple. They started work on this in 2019, in their own confession in one of the Tento talks. That was 7 years ago. If we gave them 3 more years of development, look, they wouldn't have fixed bugs, they would have just had 20 more random events or 20 more mechanics that just didn't work as well. This release forced them to confront a reality of sorts, but it also has now shot Paradox even more in the foot regarding future releases. Imperator Rome was a problematic release, so was Victoria 3. And the goal was to do EU5 release good, with all the features right away, a game with half a decade of real development behind it, with like 10 DLCs worth of stuff available from day one, and 40 countries worth of full content to play. The idea was to shatter the argument that Paradox games are only fun after a couple years of development. And hey, at least now the people that argue that Paradox games don't have enough mechanics on release can't say the same for EU5. So we did it, Reddit, we actually did that line of reasoning. But it's nevertheless somewhat poetic just how similar Leviathan and EU5 are when we start to look deeper into it. For one, much like Leviathan, the communication before release was the biggest, if that makes sense, Paradox had done up to that point. And content in the update release-wise, well, it remains unparalleled in terms of scope and, dare I say, ambition. But Leviathan forced the next DLC for EU4 to get delayed, and that DLC in question, Origins, was just, in essence, a small flavor pack for some countries around the Mali area. Same for the DLC afterwards, Line of the North would be a small flavor pack basically around Sweden, Poland, and the likes of the Baltic. EU4 would not see any significant or even noticeable mechanic updates until Domination, which was a year after the release of Leviathan, by which point I would say 75% of the bugs had been fixed, and basically every single mechanic added by Leviathan had been reworked. As for what this means for EU5, the first DLC has already been delayed. Quietly, without much fanfare, but a delay nevertheless. So for those saying that you need to wait for DLC to fix EU5, I'm sorry, it looks like Paradox is going to have to actually on that one as well. It's truly just poetic, yet again, how much this development mirrors Leviathan. Although EU5 is somewhat just so much less buggy and functional than Leviathan, and this is weirdly enough actually reflected in the Steam reviews. That all being said, every cloud has a silver lining and so does this one. Eventually Leviathan was after all fixed, and in hindsight, yes, it was a transformative major update that redefined EU4 in many ways in a good way. Because a lot of features that people have cited that they love for EU4, ranging from the diplomacy favor system to the government capacity mechanics to great projects and so on and so forth, those were Leviathan additions after all. Should EU5 be a Leviathan that gets resolved, well, smooth sailing from here. That being said, it doesn't just happen automatically. Paradox can't just AFK until bugs are fixed, right? The implementations need to be well implemented and bugs resolved, the mechanics need to be rebalanced to be good, and just because they have done it before doesn't mean they can or will do it again. And the other truth of the matter is, and we have to be honest here, Leviathan did leave scars. Fiji, being a formidable nation by anyone, or an Australian tribe being best in the world at specifically resisting shock damage, and other small nonsense like that, does exist in EU4 to this day. EU5 will have small nonsense like that as well, now for the rest of its lifetime. I believe the task of a full everything fix is both impossible and frankly unwanted. Dev attention is after all better applied elsewhere than stopping the Roman Empire forming Fiji. But EU4 had and continues to have Leviathan moments. And EU5 will have its release moments, its Leviathan, if you will. Now, normally I would thank my channel members now and call it a day, but I'm going to make an exception to end on a different note. A quote, if you will, not from a philosopher or something like that, but a song lyric from Sin Shake Sin. History wouldn't have to repeat itself if we listened once in a while.